Richard smiled when the judge approved our divorce settlement. Not a wide smile, not enough for anyone else in the courtroom to call it cruel. Just a small lift at the corner of his mouth. I knew that smile. I had watched it appear across conference tables, dinner parties, mortgage closings, and arguments he believed he had won for 34 years. It meant the same thing every time. Done? The judge looked down at the papers in front of her. Having reviewed the agreement and heard from both parties, the court finds the settlement to be fair and voluntarily entered. The agreement is approved. Richard exhaled beside his attorney. Then he leaned back. That was when he smiled. And for 3 full seconds, I thought my marriage had ended exactly the way Richard wanted it to. He would keep control of Lawson Systems. I would keep the house in Brookhaven, my retirement accounts, and the settlement amount our attorneys had spent 4 months negotiating. On paper, it looked respectable. Clean, even. 34 years of marriage reduced to columns, signatures, account numbers, and 2 people agreeing not to ask for anything else. Richard had fought hardest for the company. Not the lake cabin. Not the investment account. Not even the house where we had raised our children. The company. He had spoken about Lawson Systems during negotiations the way some men speak about a family name. His creation. His legacy. His life's work. I had stopped correcting people years ago. Maybe that was my first mistake. Richard's attorney, Martin Keller, began gathering his files. My lawyer, Helen Price, leaned toward me. You all right? I nodded. I wasn't sure what else to do. There are moments you imagine will feel enormous when they finally arrive. The end of a marriage should have been one of them. Instead, I noticed stupid things. The judge's coffee had gone cold. One fluorescent light above the clerk's desk flickered every few seconds. Richard had worn the navy tie our daughter gave him for Father's Day. And there was a faint scratch across the leather folder in front of me that I didn't remember seeing before. That was divorce, apparently. 34 years ending beneath bad lighting while everyone worried about parking validation. The clerk began collecting copies of the agreement. Richard stood. He buttoned his jacket and looked at me for the first time since the judge had entered. Maggie? Just my name. Nothing else. No apology. No anger. Maybe he thought we had already said everything there was to say. Then Martin stopped turning pages. I noticed because everyone else was moving. Helen was putting her pen away. The clerk was speaking to the bailiff. Richard had one hand on the back of his chair. But Martin Keller had gone completely still. He was staring at a page near the back of a thick exhibit binder. He turned it over. Then back again. His forehead tightened. Richard. Richard glanced down. What? Martin didn't answer immediately. He pulled the binder closer. I watched his finger trace a line near the bottom of the page. Then he looked at the next sheet. His face changed. It wasn't dramatic. That was what made me notice. Martin had been Richard's corporate attorney for almost 9 years. He was the kind of man who could tell you your building was on fire and somehow make it sound like a scheduling issue. But now the color had left his face. He looked up at Richard. What is Appendix C? The courtroom seemed to become quieter around those 2 words. Richard frowned. Appendix what? Martin turned the binder toward him. Appendix C. Richard gave the page a quick glance. I don't know. You signed the underlying agreement. That was 30 years ago. Martin lowered his voice. I still heard him. So you've seen this before? Richard's jaw tightened. I said I don't remember it. Helen stopped putting away her papers. She looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us knew what we were looking at yet. Martin flipped several pages toward the front. Then back again. There were handwritten exhibit numbers in the top corner, old photocopy marks, and one faded corporate stamp. He pulled out a yellow tab. Margaret Lawson. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard my full name from Richard's side of the courtroom all morning. What about me? I asked. Martin looked at me. Then at Helen. Then back at the document. This schedule has your name on it. Helen stood. May I see that? Martin didn't hand it over. That was the second moment I knew something was wrong. The first had been his face. The second was the way he protected the page. Richard leaned closer. For God's sake, Martin, what is it? Martin ignored him. His eyes moved down the document again. I could see only fragments from where I sat. Lawson Technical Systems, Inc. A date from 1991. My maiden name. a reference to intellectual property. And near the bottom, one sentence underlined in faded blue ink. I knew that handwriting. Mine. Something old shifted at the edge of my memory. A conference room. A newborn who hadn't slept through the night in 6 weeks. Richard telling me we could finish the paperwork later. An attorney pushing 3 documents across a polished wooden table. I had signed 2. I suddenly remembered that much. Martin turned toward Richard. Did Margaret ever execute the conversion schedule? Richard stared at him. What conversion schedule? The one required under this appendix. Richard's expression hardened. That document is obsolete. Martin looked at him for a long second. Then he said the first words that wiped the smile completely from my husband's face. No, Richard. He tapped the page. If she never signed this, it may be the opposite of obsolete. Helen was already on her feet. What exactly does that mean? Martin did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Richard. And then he asked the question that would reopen more than our divorce. It would reopen the story of our entire marriage. Richard? His voice dropped. Did Margaret ever sign the conversion schedule? Richard didn't answer. For most of our marriage, silence had been one of his favorite ways to control a room. If he wanted someone to explain too much, he waited. If he wanted them to become nervous, he waited longer. But this silence was different. He wasn't controlling anything. He was thinking. Martin Keller watched him for another second, then turned toward the judge. Your Honor, may we have a moment before the parties leave? The judge had already begun signing the final papers. She looked over the top of her glasses. I thought we were finished, Mr. Keller. So did I. Beside me, Helen stopped putting away her files. That was the moment my stomach tightened. Not when Martin said Appendix C. Not when Richard's smile disappeared. When my own attorneys stopped packing. The judge glanced at the clock. You have 5 minutes. Thank you. The clerk paused. Richard sat back down. Martin reopened the exhibit binder. What exactly are you looking at? Richard asked. Martin turned several pages. A schedule attached to the original Lawson Technical Systems agreement. That agreement was replaced years ago. Maybe. Richard's eyes hardened. There's no maybe. Martin didn't argue. He simply kept reading. Helen leaned toward me. Do you remember an Appendix C? No. Anything called a conversion schedule? I shook my head. The phrase meant nothing. At least I thought it meant nothing. Then Martin pulled one page from the binder and placed it flat on the table. I saw a name near the top. Not Maggie Lawson. Not the name I had used for more than 3 decades. Margaret Ann Whitmore. My maiden name. For a second, the courtroom disappeared. I saw a conference room with cheap vertical blinds. A paper cup of coffee. Our daughter Emily's diaper bag sitting under my chair. Richard was younger then. Dark hair, rolled up sleeves, more impatient than polished. There had been documents spread across a table. I remembered signing something. Maybe several things. And I remembered telling someone I wanted one section changed. Then the memory vanished as quickly as it had come. What does it say? I asked. Martin looked at me, then at Helen. This schedule references certain technical contributions made by Margaret before the company's first major financing round. Richard let out a breath through his nose. Maggie did early work for the company. Nobody has ever denied that. Early work? 2 words. So small they almost made me laugh. I didn't. Helen held out her hand. I'd like to see the document. Martin hesitated. Only for a second. But the judge noticed. Counsel? Martin nodded to his associate. Make them a copy. Richard turned toward him. You're overreacting. I'm reading. You've had these records for months. Yes. So why is this suddenly a problem? Martin looked down at Appendix C. Because I assumed this was historical paperwork. And now I'm not sure. The copy reached Helen. She read silently. I tried to read upside down from beside her, but most of it was legal language I hadn't seen in 30 years. Dates. Defined terms. References to exhibits. My old name appeared twice. Then again beside a line labeled, Conversion Schedule. Helen tapped it. What was supposed to be converted? Martin answered carefully. I don't know yet. Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. There, exactly. Martin ignored him. Helen kept reading. Why is Margaret's signature line blank? Richard looked towards the page. Because it's a copy. Helen turned to Martin. Is there a signed version in the file? Martin didn't answer immediately. He flipped through the binder. Then he opened another folder. Then he checked the index. I watched his expression change again. Not panic. Martin Keller did not look like a man who panicked. He looked like a man who had just discovered that something he assumed existed might not exist at all. I don't see one here. Richard's voice sharpened. That proves nothing. No, Martin said, it doesn't. Helen looked at me. Maggie, do you remember signing this? I stared at the blank line. I wanted to say yes. Not because I remembered. Because yes would make everything simple. Yes would mean the document had been completed, filed, forgotten, and buried exactly where old business documents belonged. But something about the page bothered me. The date. March 1991. Emily had been 6 months old. I had been sleeping in 90-minute pieces. Richard and I were trying to keep the company alive while pretending we weren't terrified. I remembered an attorney named Alan Pierce placing 3 documents in front of me. I remembered Richard telling me we needed everything signed before Friday. I remembered signing 2. Then I remembered pushing one back. I don't know. Richard turned toward me. You don't remember? No. That's not the same as saying you didn't sign it. I know. His voice softened slightly. Maggie, we signed dozens of documents back then. I know that too. Helen studied me. Why do you think you pushed one back? I'm not sure. Was something wrong with it? A little more came back. Numbers written in a margin. Richard saying they could fix it later. My own voice saying I wasn't comfortable signing something I didn't understand. I closed my eyes for a moment. I think there was something I wanted changed. Richard shook his head. This is 33 years ago. Yes. You can't possibly rely on that. I'm not relying on anything. I'm remembering. The judge spoke from the bench. Mr. Keller, does this issue potentially affect the settlement that was just approved? Martin stood. I'm not prepared to say that, Your Honor. That was not my question. He paused. It could. Richard turned toward him. Martin. The judge raised a hand. That's enough. The room went quiet. I am not undoing a settlement based on an incomplete document and 30-year-old memories, but neither am I going to ignore a potentially material exhibit. Helen nodded. The judge continued. I want counsel to determine whether a completed version of this schedule exists, whether it was incorporated into any later agreement, and whether it was accounted for in the valuation submitted to this court. Richard leaned forward. Your Honor, this is ancient corporate paperwork. The judge looked at him. Then it should be very easy to resolve. He sat back. Martin gathered the pages again. But before closing the binder, he looked at Richard. You were there when this was drafted, weren't you? Richard's jaw tightened. Yes. And you signed the underlying agreement? Yes. Martin tapped the blank line beside my old name. Richard, you were there. Richard said nothing. Martin's voice dropped. Do you remember her refusing to sign it? Richard looked at the page. Then at me. Then back at Martin. He waited. At first I thought he was trying to remember. But I had known Richard for 34 years. I knew the difference between memory and calculation. And as I watched him choose his silence, I understood something I hadn't understood a minute earlier. He wasn't trying to remember. He was deciding what to say. Richard finally answered Martin. I don't know. 4 words. Quiet, controlled, reasonable. Exactly the kind of answer Richard had spent most of his life perfecting. The judge gave both legal teams 48 hours to locate the original corporate records and determine whether the missing schedule had ever been completed. Nothing else was going to happen that morning. But something had already changed. The divorce I had walked into court expecting to finish was no longer finished. And somewhere inside a 33-year-old corporate file was a document with my maiden name on it that my husband apparently needed time to think about before answering. Helen and I were halfway down the courthouse steps when she stopped. Maggie. I turned. Before we do anything else, I need you to tell me exactly what you did at Lawson Systems. I almost laughed. Not because the question was funny, because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked it that plainly. What do you mean? I mean, before Richard became CEO, before investors, before the company had 3 buildings and a communications department, what did you actually do? I looked back toward the courthouse doors. Richard and Martin were still inside. I worked there. Helen gave me a patient look. Doing what? The answer should have been simple. Instead, I found myself looking 33 years backward, before the headquarters with its polished glass lobby. Before Richard appeared in trade magazines beneath headlines about innovation. Before anyone introduced him as the man who built Lawson Systems. There had been a rented industrial unit with a leaking roof, a folding table, 2 second-hand computers. And me. In 1988, Richard Lawson had an idea. I had a machine that could actually make it work. There is a difference. Richard was 29 then. Dark hair, too much energy, a confidence that made people lean toward him even when he had no proof yet. He could walk into a room with 3 sketches and leave with someone interested in financing the 4th. He understood people instinctively. What they wanted. What frightened them. What made them feel that saying yes had been their idea all along. I understood systems. I had studied mechanical engineering and spent 4 years working for a manufacturer that built temperature control equipment for industrial processing plants. It wasn't glamorous. Nobody makes movies about pressure valves. But I loved the work. Machines were honest. If something failed, there was a reason. You could test it, measure it, find the weak point and fix it. Richard used to say that was why we worked so well together. I can sell the future, he told me once. You can make sure it doesn't explode. For a while, that was our marriage too. He imagined. I made things hold. The first Lawson system began on our kitchen table. Richard had noticed the problem in smaller manufacturing plants. Their control systems were expensive, difficult to recalibrate, and prone to shutting down when one stage drifted outside tolerance. He believed there had to be a simpler way to manage the process. He was right. His first drawing was also completely useless. I told him so. He looked offended for about 6 seconds. Then he handed me the pencil. Fine, fix it. So I did. I redesigned the cooling sequence, then the pressure regulation, then the sensor arrangement. The first prototype overheated. The second leaked. The third ran for 11 minutes before a relay burned out and filled our garage with smoke. Richard threw open the door, coughed twice, and said, "Progress." I threw a rag at him. By prototype 6, we had something that could survive an actual demonstration. The critical piece was a calibration sequence I developed after weeks of failed testing. It allowed the system to compensate for temperature variation without shutting the entire process down. At first, Richard called it my ridiculous little workaround. Then we demonstrated it for a plant manager who had spent 20 years fighting exactly that problem. He watched the system correct itself in real time. Then he looked at Richard. How soon can you install 10? Richard never called it ridiculous again. That was the beginning. Not the version printed years later in company brochures. Not the version polished by public relations people who hadn't been born when our garage smelled like burned insulation. The real beginning. For the first 2 years, Richard and I did almost everything. I designed. I tested. I trained technicians. I wrote technical manuals at our dining room table. I answered customer calls from home because the office phone forwarded to our kitchen after 6. Richard sold. He negotiated with suppliers. He found customers we had no business landing. He convinced a small bank to extend a credit line after 2 larger ones had already said no. We were exhausted almost all the time. We were frightened more often than we admitted. And for a while we were happy. There was no ceremony around who had contributed what. No one kept score. We said our company because that was simply what it was. Then Emily was born. I told myself I would take 6 weeks away. 6 became 10. 10 became 12. The company was growing faster than either of us had expected, and motherhood turned my sense of time into something unreliable. I would feed Emily at 2 in the morning and review drawings at 3. I would arrive at this office with a diaper bag over one shoulder and leave with grease on my sleeve. Richard kept saying the same thing. We're close. Close to the next contract. Close to outside financing. Close to hiring people who could finally take some of the load from us. I believed him. And I believed something else too. I believed that because I had been there at the beginning, because my work was inside the product itself, paperwork could never change what we both knew. At 31, that felt obvious. Years later, I would understand how dangerous obvious things can be when nobody writes them down. The first investor who mattered was Arthur Bell. Arthur was not impressed by stories about potential. He wanted documents. He wanted to know who owned what. Which designs had been created before incorporation? Which were developed afterward? Who had assigned rights to the company? Who had not? For the first time, the messy kitchen table years had to be translated into legal language. Richard answered the first ownership question quickly. The company owns the technology. I remember turning my head toward him. Not because I thought he was lying. Because until that exact moment, I had never seriously considered the distinction. We had built it. The company was ours. So if the company owned it, I assumed that meant the same thing. The attorneys did not. They started asking for dates. Not approximate dates. Exact ones. When had I drawn the first calibration system? Was it before Lawson Technical Systems had been incorporated? Had I been an employee when I created it? Had I ever formally transferred the work? I didn't know. Neither did Richard. That was when Alan Pierce entered the story. Alan was a young corporate attorney with narrow glasses, suspenders, and a permanent ink stain on the side of his right hand. His job was to clean up everything Richard and I had done casually. Ownership schedules, employment documents, technical assignments, investor rights, pieces of paper that felt much less important to me than keeping a growing business alive. Alan tried to explain all of it carefully. I wish I had listened more carefully. But there were meetings I attended with Emily sleeping beside my chair. Documents I read while wondering whether I had enough formula left in the diaper bag. Conversations about percentages at a time when getting 4 uninterrupted hours of sleep felt more valuable than equity. Richard handled most of the investor discussions. I answered the technical questions, and without either of us announcing it, our roles started shifting. People came to the office specifically to meet Richard. I became the person called in when something didn't work. At first, that arrangement made sense to me. He was better in front of people. I was better in front of a broken system. I didn't resent it. Not then. Helen had been silent while I talked. We were sitting in a coffee shop across from the courthouse now, our drinks untouched between us. She opened her notebook. You created the calibration process? Yes. Before the financing? Yes. Before the company was formally organized the way it is now? Some of it, yes. And you wrote the original technical specifications? Most of them. Helen looked up. Maggie, that's not helping your husband with his company. I know that now. Did you know it then? I looked through the window at the traffic moving past the courthouse. No, that was the truth. Back then, I didn't think of contribution as leverage. I thought of it as marriage. Helen turned a page. Let's go back to the 1991 financing meeting. I nodded. The conference room? Yes. Something tightened in my chest. The memory had been following me since the courtroom. Not clearly. More like a shape behind frosted glass. Alan's conference room. Cheap vertical blinds rattling whenever a truck passed outside. Emily in a carrier beside my chair. Richard checking his watch because he had another meeting across town. 3 documents arranged in front of me. I remember 3 things, I said. Helen waited. I signed the first document. What was it? I don't remember. The second? I think I signed that too. And the third? I closed my eyes. The image sharpened. Alan sliding a page toward me. Numbers in a column. A paragraph I had read twice. My hand holding the pen but not touching the paper. Richard saying, Maggie, we need to finish this today. I heard myself asking Alan a question. Not about ownership. About what I would receive in return. What were you asking for? Helen said. I don't remember exactly. But something was wrong? I thought something was wrong. Helen leaned forward. What happened next? I saw myself sliding the document back across the table. Alan taking it. Richard leaning toward me. We'll fix that part later. I opened my eyes. I didn't sign one of them. Helen didn't move. You're certain? As certain as I can be about something that happened 33 years ago. Did Richard know? That part came more easily. Yes. How? He was sitting next to me. What did he say? I looked down at the table. He said we'd fix it later. Helen wrote that down. For several seconds, the only sound between us was the scratch of her pen. Then my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I looked at the screen. A message from Martin Keller. We found the 1991 closing index. Helen moved her chair closer. A second message appeared. There appears to be a document missing from the executed set. I read it again. Helen looked at me. Does he say which one? Before I could answer, another message arrived. I'm pulling the original closing file now. Nothing else. No explanation. No answer. Just a missing document. Helen stood and reached for her coat. Where are you going? I asked. To make sure nobody decides that file is obsolete before we see it. I stayed seated for one more second. 33 years earlier, in a conference room I had almost forgotten, someone had placed a document in front of me. Richard had wanted it signed. I had pushed it back. And now, for the first time since that morning, I found myself wondering not only what had been written on that page, but why Richard had been so sure we could deal with it later. Because whatever that third document was, it was missing now. The original closing file arrived at Helen's office just after 6 that evening. Not electronically. Not as a scanned attachment. A courier carried in a gray archival box with reinforced corners, 2 evidence labels, and the kind of dust that made everyone in the room suddenly aware of how long 33 years really was. Martin had agreed that both sides should review it together. That was the first thing that worried me. The second was that Richard came too. He entered 10 minutes after Martin, still wearing the same suit he had worn to court, but without the tie. He looked tired. Not defeated. Richard did not know how to look defeated. But some of the confidence from that morning had gone missing. Helen cleared one end of the conference table. No one removes anything from the box, she said. Martin nodded. Agreed. Richard sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was strange to think that 12 hours earlier, we had expected never to sit across from each other with lawyers again. Now our divorce settlement was sitting somewhere beneath a document nobody could find. Martin lifted the lid. Inside were folders labeled in Alan Pierce's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Block letters. Blue ink. Everything underlined twice. Seeing it brought back more than I expected. Alan explaining that lawyers organized paper because clients rarely organized their lives. Richard laughing. Me feeding Emily a bottle while trying to read a financing memo. Martin removed the first folder. Closing checklist. Helen moved closer. He opened it. There were dates, initials, handwritten notes, and a typed list of required documents. Martin ran his finger downward. Investor subscription agreement executed. Next line. Voting agreement executed. Next. Employment and confidentiality documents executed. Then he stopped. The room became very quiet. Technical contribution agreement. A handwritten check mark sat beside it. Underneath, conversion schedule, pending revision. No check mark. No date. No initials. Richard leaned forward. Pending revision doesn't mean it was never completed. No, Martin said. It doesn't. He turned the page. There was an attached handwritten note. Alan's handwriting again. M. Whitmore requests revision to consideration and conversion terms. Final signature to follow. I read it twice. Then a third time. Something inside me shifted. Not because I suddenly understood the legal meaning. Because I remembered being that woman. Margaret Whitmore. 31 years old. Too tired. Too busy. But not too tired to know she was being asked to sign something she didn't like. Helen asked, "Do we have the revised version?" Martin opened another folder. "Let's find out." For the next 20 minutes, paper moved across the table. Draft 1. Draft 2. Correspondence with Arthur Bell's attorneys. A memo about capitalization. Another about technical assets. Then Martin found a letter from Alan Pierce to Richard dated 4 days after the meeting. He read it silently. "What?" Richard asked. Martin handed it to him. Richard's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Helen held out her hand. Martin gave her a copy. I leaned closer. The letter was short. Alan reminded Richard that Margaret's technical contribution schedule remained unresolved and that the company should not treat the matter as fully closed until the revised conversion terms were executed. Helen looked at Richard. "Did you respond?" "I don't remember." Martin checked the folder. "No reply here." Richard gave him a look. "That was 1991. "Yes." "You're talking as if I deliberately ignored it." "I'm not talking as if anything yet." That yet sat between them. Helen turned to me. "Do you remember what you wanted changed?" I looked again at Alan's note. Consideration and conversion terms. The phrase was familiar now. Not the legal wording. The argument. I remembered Richard telling me the company couldn't afford to give me what the draft proposed. I remembered asking why the value of my work seemed to disappear simply because we were married. I remembered Alan saying there were several ways to structure it. Shares. Cash later. A continuing interest. Something tied to future financing. But I couldn't remember the percentages. I thought the numbers were too low. Richard looked at me. That wasn't what happened. I met his eyes. What happened? You wanted more flexibility. I wanted the agreement to make sense. It did make sense. Then why didn't I sign it? He had no immediate answer. Martin opened the technical contribution agreement. This document is executed. Helen looked over. By whom? Margaret and the company. My signature was there. So was Richard's on behalf of Lawson Technical Systems. For half a second, relief passed across his face. There. He pointed. She signed the transfer. Martin didn't answer. He read. Slowly. Then went back to the first page. Then to Appendix C. Helen watched him. Martin? He turned the agreement sideways. I need to be precise here. Richard's hand dropped from the page. Martin continued. This agreement gives the company exclusive rights to use the technical materials identified in the appendix. Richard leaned back. Exactly. Martin raised a finger. I'm not finished. Something cold moved through me. He pointed to a paragraph near the end. The agreement also says that final transfer of the underlying rights is to occur upon completion of the conversion schedule. Helen looked down. And the conversion schedule is the unsigned document? It appears to be. Richard shook his head. No, that cannot be right. Martin kept reading. The language is awkward, but yes. The company received immediate operating rights. The ownership conversion was supposed to be documented separately. I tried to follow. Say that without lawyer words. Martin looked at me. At the time, the company clearly received permission to use the work. For how long? Exclusively. That isn't what I asked. He paused. No? Helen stepped in. What happens if the second step never happened? Martin closed the agreement halfway. We don't know yet. Richard looked almost relieved. Helen wasn't. You know something. Martin sighed. I know enough not to guess. She pointed to the documents. Then give us the range. Martin thought for a moment. At one end, a later agreement may have cured all of this, and we simply haven't found it. Richard nodded immediately. There will be one. At the other end, Martin continued, the company may have spent the last 33 years operating under rights that were never converted in the way this agreement contemplated. No one spoke. I looked at Richard. For the first time that day, he didn't look angry. He looked unsettled. I asked, does that mean the company never owned what I created? Martin answered carefully. It means I am not prepared to say that it did. The words should have felt triumphant. They didn't. I thought about the hundreds of employees at Lawson Systems, the factories, the families, the retirement plans, the products that had carried pieces of my early work into thousands of installations. I wasn't looking at a loophole. I was looking at something much larger than our divorce. Richard pushed away from the table. This is nonsense. There have been acquisitions, audits, financing rounds, lawyers, 30 years of lawyers. Martin nodded. Which is why there may be later documents. There have to be. Maybe. Richard stood. You keep saying maybe. Because right now, maybe is the most accurate word in the room. Helen returned to the closing checklist. Why was the conversion never completed? Nobody answered. Then I remembered something else. Not a document. A conversation. Richard and I standing in our kitchen a week after the financing closed. Emily asleep upstairs. I had asked him whether Alan had fixed my paperwork. Richard had been opening a bottle of wine. He told me it could wait until after the next board meeting. Then he kissed my forehead and said, "We got the investment, that's what matters." I looked across the table at him. You told me we would finish it later. Richard's face tightened. I probably did. Did we? I don't know. Martin was watching both of us now. Helen asked the question I was suddenly afraid to hear answered. After 1991, did anyone ever come back to Margaret and complete this conversion? Martin opened the final folder. Inside was a chronological index of every amendment, financing document, recapitalization, and ownership update in the early corporate records. He began turning pages. 1992, 1993, 1994, 1995. He stopped. Then checked again. Richard stared at him. Martin finally looked up. "I don't see a completed conversion here." Richard's chair scraped against the floor. "That doesn't prove anything." "No," Martin said. "But it creates a problem." "What problem?" Martin placed the original agreement beside the unsigned schedule. Then he looked directly at Richard. "If these are the controlling documents, Lawson Systems may have received the right to use Margaret's work." He tapped the blank signature line. "But not necessarily the right to call the underlying ownership its own." Richard said nothing. "Neither did I." And suddenly the question was no longer whether Appendix C mattered to our divorce. It was something much more dangerous. For 33 years, what exactly had Richard been telling everyone the company owned? That question followed me home. Not because I suddenly understood the legal consequences of Appendix C. I didn't. Helen had warned me twice not to jump ahead. There were still documents to find, amendments to review, corporate records to reconcile. But I understood something simpler, something harder. For most of my adult life, Richard had told a story about Lawson Systems. I had heard him tell it so many times that I could almost recite it with him. A young entrepreneur sees a problem. He takes a risk. He builds a company from nothing. He refuses to quit. Years later, thousands of customers depend on what he created. It was a good story. There was only one problem. I had been there. The first time Richard was profiled in a business magazine, the article called him the founder of Lawson Systems. Singular. I remember sitting at our kitchen counter with the magazine open beside my coffee. Emily was 8. Michael was 5. Richard came downstairs in his running clothes and found me staring at the page. "They made you sound like you built the whole thing by yourself," I said. He leaned over my shoulder. "They always simplify these things. You could have corrected them." He kissed the top of my head. "Maggie, it's a 2-page article." At the time, I let it go. That was how it happened. Not in one dramatic moment, in small ones. A trade show introduction. A newspaper quote. A company anniversary speech. Richard would be called founder. I would stand beside him. Sometimes he corrected people. At first, "This never would have worked without Maggie." Or, "She was the engineer. I just talked too much." People laughed. So did I. Then the corrections became less frequent. Eventually they stopped. By the company's 15th anniversary, the official history described Richard as the man who developed the foundational system that launched Lawson Technical Systems. I saw the sentence before the brochure went to print. I remember staring at it. Then closing the file. I told myself it didn't matter. The people who mattered knew. Richard knew. I knew. Our children knew. At least I believed they did. That was enough. Until it wasn't. By the time Lawson Systems moved into its current headquarters, almost nobody at the company remembered I had once worked there. I was introduced at events as Richard's wife, Maggie. If someone asked whether I had a career of my own, I usually said I had studied engineering before the children were born. That answer was technically true. It was also incomplete enough to become another kind of lie. I had not simply studied engineering. I had built part of the system that paid for the room we were standing in. But saying that out loud felt strangely embarrassing, as if I were asking for credit too late. So I learned not to ask. Richard learned not to offer. Helen called the next morning. "I need you in the office." What happened? We started comparing the divorce valuation to the old corporate history. I sat up straighter. "And?" "I'd rather show you." An hour later, I was sitting across from Helen with 3 binders stacked between us. Our forensic accountant, Nora Patel, sat beside her. Nora was in her late 40s, wore plain black glasses, and spoke with the unnerving calm of someone who trusted numbers more than people. She opened the first binder. "This is the valuation Richard's team submitted during settlement negotiations." I nodded. I had seen parts of it before. Pages of percentages, discount rates, projected earnings, retained interests. The company had been treated as Richard's central asset. That much I understood. Nora turned to a highlighted section. "Look at the description of origin and ownership." I read it. Founded by Richard Lawson in 1988. Proprietary systems developed under company direction and subsequently held by Lawson Systems and its successors. I read it again. Under company direction? Nora nodded. That language matters for valuation. Helen watched me. What does it leave out? I almost laughed. Me. Nora turned another page. There were references to Richard's early capital contributions, his management role, his financing efforts, his continued leadership. All true. But my technical work appeared only once, buried in a paragraph describing early collaborative engineering assistance. Assistance. I looked at Helen. They made me sound like I helped him carry boxes. Helen didn't smile. Did you ever see this wording during negotiations? No. You saw the valuation summary? Yes. Not the historical assumptions? No. Nora closed the binder halfway. This doesn't prove misconduct. Richard's lawyer would have appreciated her. She never used a dramatic word when a precise one was available. But, she continued, it tells us the company was valued on the assumption that its core intellectual property was cleanly owned, and that Richard's historical position as founder was consistent with the ownership record. I looked at her. And if that assumption is wrong? We're not there yet. Again, not there yet. I was beginning to understand how lawyers and accountants survived stressful lives. They refused to arrive anywhere before the paperwork did. Helen slid another document toward me. This is one of Richard's interrogatory responses. It was from early in the divorce. A question about whether I claimed any separate ownership interest in Lawson Systems' intellectual property. Richard's response had stated, "No such interest is known to exist." I stared at the sentence. Known to whom? Helen said nothing. That was not an accidental silence. I looked up. You think he knew? I think we need evidence before we say that. For the first time since Appendix C appeared, anger came faster than fear. Not because of the money. I still didn't know what any of this was worth. What hurt was the confidence of the sentence. No such interest is known to exist. As if my role in the beginning had been so insignificant that it required no investigation. As if 33 years had not contained a single reason to ask me. He could have called me, I said. Helen nodded. Yes. He could have asked. Yes. He didn't. No. I stood and walked to the window. Across the street, a delivery truck was backing into an alley. For some reason, the beeping reminded me of the old industrial unit. Richard holding a flashlight while I crawled under the first prototype. Richard handing me a wrench. Richard saying, if this works, we might actually have something. Not it. We. When had that changed? I couldn't identify a day. That was the worst part. People imagine betrayal as a door slamming, a confession, a photograph, a name on a hotel bill. Sometimes it is quieter. Sometimes one person simply tells a story often enough that the other person disappears from it. Helen came to stand beside me. Maggie, I need you to be careful about something. What? Don't turn this into a conclusion before we have one. I'm not. You are. I looked at her. She softened. You've just discovered that the legal version of your marriage may not match the lived version. That's going to make every old memory look intentional. I hated that she was right. So what do? We find out what Richard knew. Nora spent the rest of the day tracing old capitalization records, board minutes, financing files, and archived correspondence. At 4:12 she called. Not Helen. Me. Maggie, are you still at home? Yes. Can you get to Helen's office? My stomach tightened. What did you find? A pause. An internal memo. What kind of memo? 1997. 6 years after the original financing. I sat down. Who wrote it? Corporate finance. What does it say? Another pause. Then, it references the unresolved Appendix C conversion. I stopped breathing. Unresolved? That's the word. And Richard? Nora was quiet for half a second. He's on the distribution list. I gripped the phone harder. That doesn't mean he read it? No. Does it? No. I knew there was more. Nora. Yes? What aren't you telling me? She exhaled. The copy in the archive has a handwritten notation at the bottom. Whose? We're comparing it now. To what? To Richard's signatures from the same period. I closed my eyes. Read me the notation. I don't want to do that until we authenticate it. Nora. Silence. Then she said, "It's 4 words." I waited. She read them slowly. "Hold until Maggie signs." For several seconds, I heard nothing except the sound of my own breathing. 6 years after Richard told me we would fix the paperwork later, someone inside Lawson Systems was still waiting. And if that handwriting belonged to Richard, then the question was no longer whether he had forgotten Appendix C. The question was much worse. How long had he remembered? By the time I reached Helen's office, Nora had already enlarged the memo on the conference room screen. 4 words sat at the bottom of a page written 27 years earlier. Hold until Maggie signs. I stood in the doorway and stared at them. The handwriting looked familiar. Not because I could identify every curve or slant. Because I had seen Richard write my name thousands of times. Birthday cards. Checks. Notes left beside the coffee maker. Forms sent home from the children's school. Maggie. His capital M always leaned forward, as if even his handwriting was in a hurry. The M on the screen did too. Helen pulled out the chair beside her. "Sit down." "Is it his?" Nora didn't answer. That meant they were still being careful. I was beginning to hate careful answers. We compared it to 16 known samples from 1996 through 1998, she said. Board notes, financing documents, 2 handwritten approvals, and a letter Richard sent to the company's outside accountant. And? The characteristics are consistent. Consistent? Helen stepped in. We've sent copies to a document examiner. Until she gives us an opinion, that's as far as we go. I looked again at the screen. Richard is on the distribution list. Yes, Nora said. And somebody wrote that. Yes. And you think it was him? Nora folded her hands. I think we need the examiner. The conference room door opened. Martin walked in first. Richard came behind him. No tie again. No smile. He saw the memo on the screen and stopped. Just for a second. But I saw it. Helen did too. Martin closed the door. Richard, he said, before anyone says anything else, I need you to look at the handwritten note. Richard didn't sit. He studied it from across the room. Then he looked at Martin. What about it? Is it yours? Silence. Not the silence from the courtroom. That one had been calculation. This one felt like recognition. Richard walked closer. I may have written it. Something inside me went still. Martin's face tightened. May have? It looks like my handwriting. Do you remember writing it? No. Nora turned the memo toward him, even though it was already on the screen. This memo specifically identifies the Appendix C conversion as unresolved. I can read. And the notation says to hold the matter until Maggie signs. Yes. So in 1997, someone believed her signature was still required. Richard pulled out a chair. Apparently, Martin didn't sit. And if this is your note, then you knew that. Richard looked at him. I knew there was paperwork outstanding. The sentence landed softly, almost politely. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then I heard myself say, You knew. Richard turned toward me. Maggie? No. I pointed at the screen. You stood in court yesterday and acted as if you barely remembered Appendix C. I barely remembered Appendix C. But 6 years after you told me we would fix it later, you wrote, hold until Maggie signs. If I wrote it. You just said it looks like your handwriting. That doesn't mean I remembered it 30 years later. Helen touched my arm. Not to stop me. Just enough to remind me that we were still collecting facts. Martin finally sat down. What happened after this memo? Nora opened another file. That's what matters. She brought up a timeline. 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002. Each date had a transaction beside it. A refinancing. An outside investment. A small acquisition. A credit facility. A later recapitalization. Richard stared at the screen. What is this? Transactions in which the company described ownership of its core technical assets. Martin's face changed again. Not dramatically. But I had learned to watch Martin Keller when he stopped blinking. He was doing it now. Nora clicked the first entry. In 1999, Lawson Systems represented to a lender that it owned all intellectual property material to its operations. Richard shrugged. Standard language. Yes. Next. In 2003, during the Weston acquisition, substantially the same representation. Next. 2008 financing. Another. 2014 credit agreement. Then the most recent. And this valuation prepared for the divorce. Helen looked at Richard. Same underlying assumption. Richard leaned back. You're making this sound like fraud. Nora shook her head immediately. I am not making that conclusion. Good. I'm showing you that the assumption repeated. Martin looked at her. Do any of those files contain a later assignment from Maggie? We haven't found one. Any conversion schedule? No. Any ratification? Not yet. Richard seized on the words. Not yet. Nora nodded. Correct. There are 30 years of records. Yes. Different lawyers. Yes. Different accountants. Yes. And you expect me to believe every one of them missed this? Nora looked at him. I don't expect you to believe anything. I expect us to find the documents. That silenced him. For about 5 seconds. Then Richard looked at me. You understand what this is, don't you? I almost laughed. No, Richard. Apparently I didn't understand what this was for 33 years. This company has thousands of employees. I know. Pension obligations, contracts, customers. I know. And now Helen is going to turn an unfinished piece of paperwork from 1991 into a weapon? Helen's voice stayed level. Your wife did not create the missing signature. Richard ignored her. Maggie, whatever happened with that schedule, you knew the company was using the technology. Yes. You benefited from the company. Yes. Our family benefited. Yes. You never objected. I looked at him. How could I object to something you never told me was still unresolved? His mouth opened, then closed. That was the first time the room truly changed. Because until then, Richard had been defending the company. Now he was defending himself. Martin saw it too. When did you last know this was unresolved? Richard rubbed his forehead. I don't know. 1997? Clearly there was some issue in 1997. Did you instruct anyone to follow up with Maggie? I don't remember. Did you tell her? I don't remember. Did you discuss it with Alan Pierce? I don't remember. Martin leaned back. You're going to need better answers than that. Richard's eyes sharpened. For whom? Martin didn't answer immediately. Nora did. Potentially more people than the divorce judge. The room went silent. I looked at her. What does that mean? She closed the timeline. It means this stopped being only a marital property question the moment we found evidence that the issue may have remained unresolved while the company continued making ownership representations. I felt my stomach turn. Could this hurt the company? Nora chose her words carefully. It could require questions to be answered. That isn't what I asked. I know. Martin stepped in. No one is saying Lawson Systems is about to lose its technology. Richard gave a bitter laugh. That is exactly what they want me to hear. No, Martin said. What I want you to hear is that we now have to determine what rights were transferred, what rights may have remained with Maggie, whether later agreements cured the problem, and whether any past representations need to be corrected. I stared at him. So the divorce valuation may need to be revisited. Richard turned sharply. The settlement has already been approved, Helen answered, based on a valuation that may rest on an incomplete ownership assumption. You agreed to that valuation based on what was disclosed. His eyes went to me. There it was, the anger. But beneath it was something I had rarely seen in Richard. Fear. Not fear of losing the house. Not fear of writing me a larger check. Fear of a question moving beyond his control. Martin stood and walked to the window. This needs company counsel. Richard stared at him. No? Martin turned. Yes. We are not dragging the board into my divorce. This is no longer just your divorce. Richard's voice hardened. It is until we know there's actually a problem. Martin pointed toward the screen. We know there is a question. That is not the same thing. No, but after that memo, we cannot pretend the question began yesterday. Richard looked at me again. And suddenly I understood why the words hurt so much. Not because Appendix C might be valuable. Not because the settlement might change. Because for 6 years after that first conference room, Richard had apparently carried the unfinished matter forward, while I believed it had simply been handled. Then, somewhere along the way, he stopped asking for my signature. But he never stopped calling the result his. I said quietly, "When were you going to tell me?" Richard looked exhausted. "Maggie, I don't remember making some decision to hide this from you. That isn't what I asked. I was running a company. And I was raising our children." "I know. Do you?" His face changed. For the first time, I saw something that looked almost like shame. But before he could answer, Martin's phone rang. He looked at the screen, then at us. The document examiner. Nobody moved. Martin answered and listened. "Yes?" A pause. "How strong?" Another pause. His eyes closed briefly. "All right, send me the report." He ended the call. Richard stared at him. "Well?" Martin put the phone down. "The examiner considers the notation highly consistent with Richard's known handwriting from that period." No one spoke. Richard looked at the 4 words on the screen. "Hold until Maggie signs." Martin's voice was quieter now. "So we proceed on the assumption that in 1997 you knew the conversion had not been completed." Richard didn't argue. That frightened me more than if he had. Nora closed her laptop. Helen gathered the files. I thought the meeting was over. Then Martin looked at Richard and said, "There's something else you need to understand." Richard didn't move. Martin tapped the stack of financing documents. "This isn't about how much Maggie gets in the divorce anymore." I looked at him. "Then what is it about?" Martin met my eyes. "Whether Lawson Systems owns what it has spent 30 years telling everyone it owns. For the first time since Appendix C appeared, I had leverage. Real leverage. Not the kind that came from anger. Not the kind that came from a better argument in a courtroom. The kind that made corporate lawyers cancel meetings. The kind that made board members ask whether they needed outside counsel. The kind that could hurt people who had never met me. That was what frightened me. By noon the next day, Lawson Systems had brought in its own legal team. Not Martin. Not Helen. A separate group representing the company itself. There were now too many people in conference rooms using words like exposure, remediation, historical representation, and materiality. I stopped trying to remember all of them. One thing I understood perfectly. If the ownership problem was real, the company could not simply ignore it. Richard understood that too. He hated it. "This is getting out of control," he said. We were sitting in a conference room at Lawson Systems headquarters. I had not been inside the building in almost 3 years. The lobby had changed. New furniture. New photographs. A wall-sized timeline of the company's history stretched along the main corridor. 1988, 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993. At the beginning of the timeline was a photograph of Richard standing beside our first commercial unit. The caption read, "Richard Lawson founds Lawson Technical Systems." I stopped walking. Helen stopped beside me. Richard did not. For a few seconds I looked at that photograph. I remembered the day it was taken. I had been standing 6 feet away. I knew because I had been holding the camera. Helen followed my eyes to the caption. She said nothing. Neither did I. Not yet. Inside the conference room, company counsel had arranged the documents chronologically. The 1991 Technical Contribution Agreement, Appendix C, Alan Pierce's letter, the 1997 memo, later financing representations, the divorce valuation. 33 years of paper reduced to one long table. One of the company attorneys, Laura Chen, spoke first. "We need to establish 2 things separately." Richard folded his arms. "Go ahead. First, what rights Lawson Systems legally holds today." She pointed to another stack. "Second, what historical representations may need correction if the conversion was never completed." Richard leaned forward. "May need correction." "Yes." "Not are wrong." "Correct." He looked at me as if that distinction should comfort us both. It didn't. Laura continued. "We have not found a completed conversion schedule." Richard's jaw tightened. "We've been looking for 2 days. We've looked through the principal corporate files, board records, financing files, outside counsel archives, and the scanned historical database." "Then keep looking." "We will." And until then, nobody tells the board there's an ownership problem. Laura's expression barely changed. The board has already been notified that there is a potential historical IP issue. Richard stared at her. You did what? I represent the company. I am the company. Laura held his gaze. No, Richard. The room went silent. You are the CEO. It was a small sentence. But I saw it hit him. For decades, Richard had blurred those two ideas so successfully that even I had stopped noticing. The company. Richard. The company. Interchangeable. Until suddenly they weren't. He pushed back from the table. This exists because of one unsigned schedule. Helen spoke. No, it exists because the schedule may have remained unresolved. Richard turned toward me. And now what? I knew what he was asking. Not legally. Personally. What are you going to do with this? Before I could answer, Laura opened another document. There's an additional issue. Richard laughed without humor. Of course there is. This is not a new ownership issue. I felt Helen relax slightly. Laura continued. It's an administrative history issue. She handed me a copy. It was a board package from 2004. A section on company background described the original technology as having been developed under Richard Lawson's direction. I had seen similar wording before, but attached behind it was an older internal summary. My name was in that version. Not as Richard's wife, not as an assistant. Margaret Whitmore Lawson, Technical Development and Original Systems Design. I stared at it. What happened to this version? Laura looked uncomfortable. It appears the language was shortened in later board materials. By whom? We don't know. Richard shifted in his chair. I looked at him. Do you? No. The answer came quickly. Maybe too quickly. But Chapter 6 had taught me not to confuse suspicion with proof. So I said nothing. Laura showed us another document. Then another. Earlier files mentioned my technical contribution directly. Later ones referred vaguely to a founding engineering team. Later still, there was only Richard. There was no single memo saying, erase Maggie. No order. No conspiracy. Just subtraction. A sentence shortened here. A biography simplified there. A photograph cropped. A title dropped. Until I had become a footnote in something I had helped create. Richard looked at the papers. This is branding. I stared at him. Branding? Corporate histories get simplified. So does marriage, apparently. Maggie? No, I want to understand. He looked tired. I wasn't. Not anymore. When someone called you the sole founder, did you correct them? Sometimes. At first. He said nothing. Did you correct the company brochure? No. The board materials? I didn't write them. That wasn't my question. He leaned back. I had a company to run. And I had a family to raise. We both made choices. That sentence nearly did what Appendix C had not. It nearly made me lose my temper. Instead, I asked, was disappearing from the record one of mine? Richard looked away. Laura closed the folder. I think we should stay focused on resolution. She was right. Because that was the dangerous part. Resolution. There were options. If the missing conversion could not be cured by later documents, the company could negotiate with me. Compensation. A formal assignment now. A royalty arrangement. An equity adjustment. Possibly more. My lawyers explained it carefully. I barely listened. All I could see was the timeline in the hallway. Richard Lawson founds Lawson Technical Systems. One man. One story. One photograph. Helen and I left the building just before 5. In the elevator, she asked, You understand how much leverage you may have now? Yes. Do you? The doors opened. We stepped into the lobby. Employees passed us carrying laptops and coffee. 2 young engineers stood near the security desk arguing cheerfully about a prototype test. I watched them. They were probably younger than I had been when Richard and I built our first unit. They had mortgages, children, careers, plans. None of them had erased me. None of them had sat in that 1991 conference room. I said, if I refuse to cooperate, what happens? Helen chose her answer carefully. It depends. Worst case, Transactions could slow down, the board could become more conservative, certain representations might need to be revisited, there could be litigation. Could the company be damaged? Yes. I looked again at the employees moving through the lobby. For the first time, the power of Appendix C did not feel satisfying. It felt heavy. Richard had hurt me. That did not mean I wanted 2,000 people to pay for it. That evening, Nora called with preliminary valuation scenarios. Numbers. Large ones. Larger than I expected. But instead of feeling vindicated, I felt tired. Helen asked me to meet the next morning. We need to decide what position we're taking. What are my options? We can press maximum leverage. And? Or negotiate a correction and compensation package without threatening operating stability. I knew which answer a person in a revenge story was supposed to choose. Take everything. Make him regret it. Let him watch the company burn. But Lawson Systems wasn't just Richard. That was part of the lie, too. It had never been just Richard. It had been me. Then hundreds of people. Then thousands. I had spent 33 years watching my name disappear from something I helped build. I did not want my return to destroy it. Helen slid a yellow legal pad toward me. Tell me what you want. I looked at the blank page. For once, the question felt more difficult than any legal one. Money mattered. Fairness mattered. The divorce settlement mattered. But none of them were the first thing that came to mind. I thought about the wall in the lobby, the photograph, the caption, the board files, the phrase early collaborative engineering assistance. Then I looked at Helen. I don't want the company. She waited. I don't want Richard's chair. Another pause. I don't want to punish the employees. Helen nodded slowly. Then what do you want? I knew now. For the first time since Appendix C appeared, I knew exactly. I want the record corrected. 3 weeks later, we went back to mediation. Not to finish the divorce we thought we had already finished. To rewrite it. The room was smaller than the courtroom and somehow more exhausting. No judge. No gallery. Just a long table, 2 legal teams, company counsel, Nora, a mediator named Susan Hale, and enough paper to explain how 33 years of assumptions had become one very expensive problem. Richard sat across from me. He had stopped looking angry. That worried me more. Anger was easy to read. This was something else. Fatigue, perhaps. Or the realization that control was no longer the same thing as certainty. Susan began with the obvious. We are not here to determine whether anyone acted criminally. Richard glanced toward Helen. Helen didn't react. We are here, Susan continued, because the original settlement relied on a company valuation that assumed Lawson Systems held complete ownership of certain foundational intellectual property. She looked at me. That assumption is now disputed. Then at Richard. And the parties agree that resolving the dispute is preferable to prolonged litigation. Richard gave a short nod. I did too. That was about the only thing we agreed on. Nora opened the revised valuation. The numbers were different now. Not because Lawson Systems had suddenly become worth more. Because the ownership structure underneath the valuation was no longer being treated as simple. My technical contribution had value. The rights connected to it had value. The fact that those rights had apparently never been converted exactly as the 1991 documents contemplated had value. But none of it came with a giant red number labeled Maggie wins. It came with scenarios, ranges, discounts, legal uncertainty, possible royalties, possible equity adjustments, possible settlement credits. The first number Nora showed me was large enough that I stopped hearing the next sentence. Then she showed me another number. Lower. Then another. Higher. Richard leaned back. This is absurd. Nora didn't look offended. It is a range. It is speculation. It is valuation under uncertainty. You're valuing a technical contribution from 1991 as if Maggie built the modern company. No, Nora said. We are explicitly not doing that. Then why are we here? Laura Chen, company counsel, answered before anyone else could. Because the company cannot confidently represent that the underlying rights were fully converted if the conversion schedule was never completed. Richard looked at her. And your solution is to pay Maggie twice? I felt something tighten in my chest. Twice? He looked at me. You benefited from the company for 30 years. There it was again. The house. The schools. the vacations, the retirement accounts, as if marriage had been a compensation plan. Helen spoke before I did. Richard, marital benefits are not consideration for an uncompleted intellectual property conversion. Susan raised a hand. We are not going to litigate the marriage in this room. Not yet, I thought, because that part was still waiting for us. The mediation lasted 9 hours. By the 6th, nobody was pretending there was going to be a dramatic winner. That helped. What emerged instead was something almost boring, which was probably why it was fair. Lawson Systems would receive a clean, present-day assignment of the disputed underlying rights. In exchange, my revised divorce settlement would include an additional financial payment, reflecting the historical contribution and the uncertainty created by the incomplete conversion. I would receive a small non-voting equity interest that could be bought out over time. A limited royalty structure would apply to one remaining product family, still materially using technology traceable to my original work. Not forever. Not enough to threaten the company. Enough to acknowledge that the work had not appeared from nowhere. Richard would retain control of Lawson Systems. I did not want his office. I did not want his board seat. And I did not want a judge someday deciding the value of my marriage by counting patents. But there was one term I refused to compromise. The history. Laura had drafted language for the company records. I read it aloud. Lawson Systems was founded in 1988 by Richard Lawson, with foundational technical systems and original product architecture developed in substantial part by Margaret Whitmore Lawson. I stopped. Richard stared at the document. Susan asked, "Problem?" He rubbed his jaw. "It sounds like a legal disclaimer." "It sounds accurate," I said. He looked at me. "I founded the company." "Yes." "I raised the money." "Yes." "I ran it for 30 years." "Yes." "So don't sit there acting like I stole your life." The room went quiet. I put the paper down. "I'm not." "Then what are you doing?" "Correcting a sentence." His eyes hardened. "A sentence?" "Yes." "All of this for a sentence?" I almost smiled. "No, Richard." I looked at the revised settlement. The money is for the rights. Then I touched the company history language. "This is for the truth." He looked away. Susan suggested a break. No one moved. Richard stood eventually and went to the window. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then Laura asked him quietly, "Can the company agree to the historical correction?" Richard did not turn around. "Yes." Just one word. But I felt something loosen inside me. Not victory. Relief. The final agreement took another week. There were tax provisions, release language, board approvals, a formal present-day assignment drafted so carefully that it seemed determined to prevent anyone from ever creating another Appendix C. The original divorce settlement was modified, not destroyed, not reversed into some fantasy where Richard walked away with nothing and I inherited an empire. The house remained mine. Richard retained the company. The revised financial terms were fair enough that Helen stopped using the phrase litigation leverage. And Lawson Systems changed its official history. 2 days after the board approved the settlement, Laura emailed me a screenshot of the revised corporate timeline. The old caption was gone. In its place, 1988, Richard Lawson and Margaret Whitmore Lawson established the technical and commercial foundations that became Lawson Systems. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the email. That night, Richard called. Not Martin. Not his assistant. Richard. "I saw the new timeline," he said. So did I. Silence. Then, "You got what you wanted." I looked around the apartment I had rented during the divorce. Boxes still sat unopened against one wall. "No," I said. "I got something that should have been there already." He exhaled. "You could have made this much worse." "I know." "You could have challenged half the company." "I know." "You didn't." "No." "Why?" "I thought about the young engineers in the lobby, the employees, the customers, the years of work that belonged to more people than either of us. Because I helped build it." Richard said nothing. "Why would I want to destroy it?" For a long moment, I thought that would be the end of the call. Then he said quietly, I never thought of it as destroying you." I closed my eyes. "What did you think you were doing?" Another silence. When he finally answered, his voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. I thought because you stepped away, it became mine. Richard came to the apartment 3 nights later. Not with a lawyer. Not with a binder. Not with another document that needed my signature. Just Richard. For a moment, when I opened the door, I saw the man I had married. Not the CEO. Not the defendant in a divorce. Not the man whose handwriting had sat beneath 4 words that changed everything. Just Richard. Older than the man in my memories. More tired. He looked at the half-unpacked boxes behind me. You still haven't finished moving in. I'm not sure this is where I'm staying. He nodded. I stepped aside. He came in. We sat at the small dining table. It was the first time in months we had been alone without anyone taking notes. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Richard said, "What I told you on the phone was true." I looked at him. "That because I stepped away, you decided it became yours?" He nodded. "Not all at once." "That makes it better?" "No." He rubbed both hands over his face. "I don't know how to talk about this without sounding like I'm defending myself." "Then don't." He looked at me. "I don't know if I can." That at least sounded honest. I waited. Richard stared at the table. "I was angry that you could leave." I stared at him. "I didn't leave. You left the company. I went home to raise our children." "I know." "Do you?" He closed his eyes. "I know it now." That was not enough. It was also more than he had said before. Richard leaned back. "When you were still there, everything felt shared." "The company?" "Everything." "And when I wasn't?" He hesitated. I started thinking of it as something I was carrying alone. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because of all the things he could have said, that one was the most revealing. "Alone?" "I know how that sounds." "No, I want to hear it." "Maggie?" "You were working late, traveling, raising money, hiring people." "Yes." "And I was what?" He didn't answer. "At home?" "Yes." "Doing nothing?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." He shook his head. "That isn't fair." "No." I leaned forward. "It isn't." He went still. "For 30 years, you got to call your work sacrifice." I felt my throat tighten, but I kept going. "When you missed dinner, it was because you were building something. When I missed the office, it was because I had stepped away. When you worked through weekends, people called you driven. When I stayed home with 2 sick children and a dying mother, nobody called me anything." Richard looked down. "And the worst part is, I let that happen." He looked back at me. "I didn't ask you to." "No." I nodded. "That's what I keep coming back to." He frowned. "I don't understand." "You didn't have to order anyone to erase me?" I could feel 30 years sitting in my chest. "You just had to stop correcting them." Richard's face changed. I continued. "The first time they called you Soul Founder, you corrected them." "I remember." "The second time, too." "Yes." "Then one day you stopped." He said nothing. "And after enough years, you didn't even have to lie. You believed it." His eyes lifted to mine. He looked almost offended, then almost ashamed. "I don't know when that happened." "I do." "When?" "When the version where you did it alone became easier to live with." He sat back. The room was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. For a second, I remembered the old industrial unit. Smoke in the garage. Richard coughing. Me laughing. The two of us, 29 and 31, and stupid enough to believe we would always recognize ourselves in the life we were building. Richard said, "I never thought of you as unimportant." That isn't the same as remembering me accurately. "I loved you." "I know." He stared at me. "You say that like it makes this worse." "Sometimes it does." He flinched. "I hadn't meant the line to be cruel, but I didn't take it back. Because if you hated me, this would be easier." "Maggie? If you had been some monster who planned everything from 1991, I could walk away and never wonder." He looked at me. "But you weren't." "No." "You were my husband." "Yes." "You knew what I had done." "Yes." "You watched people forget." His eyes dropped. "Yes." "And eventually you forgot too." A long silence. Then Richard said, "Yes." That was the first moment I cried. Not when Appendix C appeared. Not when the handwriting was authenticated. Not when the settlement changed. Then, one word. Yes. I turned my face away. Richard did not try to touch me. I was grateful for that. After a minute, I said, "Do you know what I lost?" He waited. "It wasn't the title." "I know." "It wasn't the equity." He nodded. "It wasn't even the money." I wiped my face. "I lost the right to tell my own children who I had been." Richard looked up sharply. "What?" "Emily called you a self-made man at Christmas 2 years ago." He closed his eyes. "Do you remember?" "Yes." "Michael said you built everything from scratch." "Yes." And I sat there. You could have said something. The second the words left his mouth, Richard knew. His face changed. I didn't need to say anything. He whispered, "That was a terrible thing to say." "Yes." "I'm sorry." I looked at him. "You know why I didn't say anything?" He shook his head. "Because after enough years, correcting the story made me feel petty." He looked devastated. I continued, "You had become the important one." That wasn't true. It became true in every room we entered. He stared at the floor. And somewhere along the way, I started wondering if maybe I had exaggerated my own importance. His head came up. "No?" "Yes." "Maggie, no. That is what you took." The words came out more quietly than I expected. "Not the company. And not the title. Not the money. My confidence in my own memory." He said nothing. "You made me wonder whether I had really built what I remembered building." Richard's eyes filled. "I didn't know." "I know. And that's the part I don't know how to forgive." He looked away. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I think I was afraid." "Of what?" "That if I admitted how much of the beginning was yours, then I would have to admit how much of everything depended on you." "That sounds like a compliment." "It isn't." "No." He gave a sad laugh. "I liked being needed." I looked at him. "You were needed." "Not in the way I wanted." I waited. "When you stepped away from the company, people came to me for everything." He swallowed. "I became important in a way I hadn't been before." "And you liked it?" "Yes." "And when the story changed?" "I didn't stop it." "And after a while?" "I started believing it." There it was. The truth without legal language. No appendix. No valuation. No board. Just vanity. Fear. And time. I asked, "Did you ever think about telling me the conversion was still unresolved?" He shook his head slowly. "Not after a while." "Why?" "Because every year made it harder." "That's not an answer." He looked at me. "Because I knew what it would mean."
"What?"
"That I had let it sit."
"And?"
"That you would ask why. And what would you have said?" His voice dropped. "The same thing I'm saying now." "Which is?" "I don't have a good reason." I nodded. That hurt, but it was honest. Richard reached toward me, then stopped before his hand crossed the table. "Is there anything left of us?" I looked at him. 34 years. 2 children. A company. A house. Birthdays. Funerals. Arguments. Vacations. Morning coffee. 1,000 ordinary days no legal document could value. I loved him. That was still true. And for the first time I understood that love and repair were not the same thing. "The record can be corrected," I said. Richard waited. "The settlement can be corrected." He nodded. "The company history can be corrected." His eyes stayed on mine. "But I don't know if 30 years of being erased can be corrected by putting my name back on a wall." His face tightened. "Maggie, I'm not saying no." He went very still. "I'm saying I don't know." He swallowed. "Is that better?" "I don't know that either." For the first time in our marriage, Richard had no argument. No solution. No next step. He simply sat there. And I realized that maybe this was what we had lost more than anything else. For 34 years, Richard had believed every problem could be solved if he controlled enough of the variables. But I was not a company. I was not a valuation. I was not an unfinished agreement. I was his wife. And there was no Appendix C for what had happened between us. When he finally stood to leave, he stopped at the door. "I do remember something." I looked at him. "The first prototype." I almost smiled. "You hated Prototype 3. It caught fire. It smoked. It caught fire, Maggie. A small laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Richard smiled too. Not the courtroom smile. Not the one that meant he had won. The old one. The one from our garage. For 1 second I missed us so badly I could barely breathe. Then he opened the door. Before he left, he looked back. I should have told them. Who? Everyone. He swallowed. That it was ours. I nodded. Yes. Richard left. I closed the door behind him. And for the first time since the divorce began, I wasn't asking what I was entitled to. I was asking something much harder. Even if Richard finally remembered who I had been, could I still remember who I was without him? 4 months after the divorce settlement was revised, I received an envelope from Lawson Systems. Not from Richard. Not from Martin. From the corporate records office. For a few seconds, I left it unopened on the kitchen counter. Old habits, apparently. 33 years earlier, paperwork had felt like something that could wait. Now I knew better. I opened it. Inside was a certified copy of the amended corporate history, the updated intellectual property assignment, and the final settlement acknowledgement approved by the board. My name appeared 7 times. Not as Richard's wife. Not as early engineering assistants. Not as a footnote. Margaret Whitmore Lawson. Foundational technical development. Original systems design. Co-creator of early product architecture. I read every line. Then I read them again. It was strange. For months, I had imagined that seeing the corrected record would feel enormous, vindicating, maybe even triumphant. Instead, it felt quiet, accurate. That was enough. The revised settlement had been finalized without another courtroom fight. Richard retained control of Lawson Systems. I moved into a smaller place 15 minutes from Emily, and the financial terms we had fought over settled quietly into the background. No empire changed hands. No one walked away ruined. Lawson Systems kept running. That mattered to me more than I expected. A month after the board approved the new history, Laura sent me a photograph of the wall in the lobby. The old caption had been replaced. Now it read, 1988, Richard Lawson and Margaret Whitmore Lawson established the technical and commercial foundations that became Lawson Systems. I stared at the photograph for a long time. Then I noticed something almost funny. They had used the same picture of Richard beside the first commercial unit. But next to it, they had added another photograph. One I had forgotten existed. I was 31. Hair pulled back. Safety glasses on top of my head. One hand resting against the prototype. Richard stood beside me. We were both smiling. Not because we knew we were building a company worth anything. Because the machine had finally worked. That photograph meant more to me than the money. Maybe that sounds foolish. At 63, I had learned that some things become more valuable precisely because they cannot be deposited in a bank. Emily called that evening. I saw the new timeline. So did I. There was a pause. Mom? Yes? Why didn't you ever tell us? I looked at the photograph on my laptop. I thought you knew. We didn't.
I know that now.
Another pause. Then she said, I wish I had. That hurt. But differently. Not like something being taken. Like something finally being returned. Michael called the next day. He asked me about the garage. The prototypes. The fire. It was smoke, I told him. Dad says it was fire. Your father has always preferred a better story. We both laughed. And for the first time, I told my son the beginning from my side. Not to correct Richard. Not to compete with him. Just because it was mine to tell. Richard and I did not get back together. Not then. Maybe that disappoints some people. There was no dramatic reconciliation outside the courthouse. No kiss in the rain. No realization that 34 years could be repaired by one honest conversation. Life is rarely that tidy. We started having coffee once every few weeks. Sometimes we talked about the children. Sometimes Lawson Systems. Sometimes nothing important at all. He apologized more than once. I believed him. Forgiveness turned out to be easier than trust. Those are not the same thing. One afternoon, Richard brought me a cardboard box. Inside were old photographs, engineering notebooks, and drawings from the first 3 years of the company. I found these in storage. I lifted one notebook. My handwriting covered almost every page. You kept them? I forgot I had them. I looked at him. He winced. Poor choice of words. I smiled despite myself. Then he became serious. I should have known what these meant. Yes. I should have known what you meant. That one took longer to answer. Yes. He nodded. There was nothing else to say. Before he left, he asked, "Do you regret stepping away?" I thought about it. The children. My mother. The years I had spent believing contribution had to happen in an office to count. No. Even now? Especially now. He looked confused. So I explained. I don't regret choosing my family. I closed the notebook. I regret believing that choice erased everything I had done before it. Richard looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded. A week later, I framed one page from that old notebook. Not the patent drawing. Not the most important technical diagram. Just the first page where I had written, Prototype 6, test again Monday. I hung it above my desk. Underneath it, in my own handwriting, I added the date. 1989. No one else needed to understand why it mattered. I did. For most of my marriage, I thought being remembered correctly depended on Richard remembering me correctly. It didn't. The company record mattered. The settlement mattered. The acknowledgement mattered. But none of them gave me back my history. They only confirmed what had already been true. I had been there. I had built something. I had chosen another life for a while. And choosing one thing had never erased the other. Richard had spent years calling the company his. For too long, I had let that make me wonder whether my part had ever been real. I don't wonder anymore. My name is on the page now. But more importantly, it is mine again. If you were in my place, what would have hurt more, the money Richard nearly kept, or realizing that someone you loved had slowly erased your role from a life you helped build? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please like the video and subscribe for more stories about marriage, hidden truths, family secrets, and the moments when people finally reclaim the part of their lives they were told no longer belonged to them.